Hello everyone, welcome to this presentation about the challenges to the EU in 2025. We're going to unpack today some of the pressing issues that are going to shape the European Union's landscape this year, from migration crisis to trade dynamics, military pressures, green transition. It's going to have to navigate a complex web of challenges, many of which you've studied previously. So this will act as an update and maybe open your eyes to some new developments. What I want you to do now is to pause the presentation, to go down to the description below where there's a link for you to download a document which will just give you a little 25 question missing gaps exercise for you to fill in as we go along to help you engage with what's going on in the video. Okay, so if you want to do that now, that would be great. So let's get started with the first challenge facing the EU this year, which is migration. It continues to be a critical issue, particularly at the eastern borders with Russia and Belarus. These regions have, in the last couple of years, have seen migrants being used as political tools. That's created a humanitarian crisis and tested EU cohesion on that eastern frontier. For example, the Belarusian regime has been deliberately funneling migrants towards the EU to try to destabilise that region. Obviously, where there's conflict at the minute. The member states are still divided on managing migration. That's still an issue for the EU. Some emphasise border security, others are advocating a more humanitarian intervention. And that discord became really evident when there were recent arguments over the funding for Frontex, which is the EU's border agency, with Ursula von der Leyen making that famous solidarity much must be matched with security speech. So there's a kind of emphasis on not allowing vulnerable people to be used as pawns in geopolitical games. But obviously, cohesion and a cohesive approach on the migrant crisis is something that's still remaining elusive. The next, of course, is going to be global trade pressures are going to be amplified this year. There's still lingering effects of Brexit that are continuing to disrupt supply chain and strain trade agreements, and that's most evident on the island of Ireland, between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which remains in the EU. And the US Inflation Reduction Act, which has come into law, has created tensions as European manufacturers are going to be up against American companies that are getting substantial subsidies for green technologies higher than they're getting in the EU. Donald Trump's return to the US presidency, of course, is going to add complexity to these with his renewed call for America First policies that will no doubt threaten transatlantic relations. And Emmanuel Macron recently warning Europe that it must stand firm against protectionism or we risk losing our industrial independence. Internally within the EU, again, cohesion raises its head. There are debates over trade imbalances between wealthy nations like Germany and some of the smaller nations. And that highlights some of the cracks that there are really in the single market. And the EU is trying to address this. It's considering measures such as strategic tariff adjustments and investments in cross-border infrastructure to try to help that cohesion and competitiveness. Another issue that's often been a thorny one for the EU is military cohesion, and there will be increased geopolitical pressure again, no doubt. With the ascension of Donald Trump and also the continuing conflict on the eastern borders of Europe. So since Russia's aggression in Ukraine, EU relies on NATO for its security. But some are starting to question that, and there's been even more intense discussions about developing an independent European defence capability under this new Strategic Compass initiative. However, those efforts are facing some resistance because people are wary of duplicating NATO's role, particularly when economics are tight. Greenland, of course, is emerging as a geopolitical hotspot, and it reflects the EU's growing interest in the Arctic. as climate change starts to open up shipping routes there. Greenland's strategic location and we believe vast natural resources, including some rare earth minerals that we need for renewable technologies, are drawing global attention, not just Donald Trump's attention, where he's not just eyeballing Greenland for those reasons, but saying it has a strategic necessity that that the US has control over it as the Arctic opens up. Um, Interestingly, it was the German Foreign Minister, Annela Baerbock, who said that I'm just going to read the quote to you here. Europe will not stand idly by while external powers attempt to reshape the Arctic. So you can see there that people are starting to, within the EU, talk about maybe there being some kind of EU military presence, which obviously is going to take a lot of organising and sorting out. And of course, the Arctic will become an area of play not just for the EU, but will become a theatre of interest for the US, for Russia, and also for China, looking at supply routes. So, despite its importance as a bloc, the EU still faces an inability to respond militarily or diplomatically because of the internal disagreements within the bloc. Member states differ on how much spending there should be. Some also worried about duplication with NATO. And, you know, there's been some prominent European politicians come forward, like Donald Tusk, who's been saying that, you know, the EU has to decide whether it wants to be a player or whether it wants to be a playground. Um, you know, I remember that old saying, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. So, you know, whether the EU has to step up into this new era of geopolitical tension and assert itself on a global stage will be an issue for discussion in 2025. Also, there's the continued discussion over enlargement. The main area, as you can see, is the Western Balkans, who are looking to seek accession, and it's a bit of a double-edged sword for the EU. Countries like Albania and North Macedonia are very, very keen to join for the geopolitical stability, for the economic growth that comes with it. But while there are existing divisions within the EU, as there are at the minute, it becomes more complex integrating those countries. Um, some countries like Poland are very pro enlargement and they're wanting a kind of enlargement that draws parallels with the 2004 leap, if you like, in the size of the EU. But even other members of the Commission are much, much more cautious, complaining about how reform can be a recipe for stagnation, and really saying that the until the EU's institutions are really concretized as being efficient, um, then really until the institutions are working 100% fully, that bringing more countries in is just going to undermine the ability to have a perfectly functioning EU. So issues such as adherence to democratic principles also come into play here. Down in some of these Balkan countries, and there are still question marks over the fiscal responsibility of some of these former Yugoslavian republics. So again, the Western Balkans will become an issue, and is the EU framework ready to handle those new members? Of course, net zero and the drive and the Green Deal becomes a continued challenge for the EU and for other areas around the globe. And this idea of getting to net zero by 2050 is coming under increasing strain. Transitioning to renewable energy while maintaining economic stability has sparked heated debates. Germany's reliance on natural gas, for instance, contrasts with France's nuclear approach. And there are still very, very different views about how energy security can be established in the EU whilst also maintaining a drive towards net zero. The EU has got a proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is like trading carbon credits. But that's been met with some global trading partners who are saying it's just basically a roundabout way of putting protectionism up around the EU. So the EU would start to add carbon neutrality to trade deals, and that could force up um, unfair barriers and create protectionism by another name. Internally, there's huge funding differences between prioritisation for the Green Deal within different countries, in particular between the more affluent and less affluent member states. And again, that cohesive redistribution of wealth becomes a major issue. Um, I think one of the biggest criticisms come from Greta Thunberg, who's saying that the EU likes to set targets but then do nothing about it. And as you can see from the diagram on the screen there, public confidence in meeting net zero targets by 2050 is falling and eroding year on year. Probably a new issue is in the proliferation of information. And actually, the EU is very, very keen to start to get involved in the spread of misinformation, which they believe threatens democratic stability across the EU. Recent events, such as Russian disinformation during the Romanian presidential election, shows how that can start to erode the public's trust in democracy and in the electoral process. So there's a Digital Services Act coming in for the EU, and that's going to hold platforms more accountable for curbing harmful content, but also trying to strike that balance between free speech and harmful content or misinformation. Um, Ursula von der Leyen said that misinformation is the silent saboteur of democracy. And civic education and media literacy programs are being rolled out across the Union. And the new European Democracy Action Plan is being currently ratified by the Commission to hopefully try and give out a digital literacy program across the EU, empowering people to be able to critically evaluate information, something which hopefully you're learning to do while you're at school. So those are the main challenges facing the EU in 2025. They're all interconnected, really. That's the important thing to remember. Migration, trade, defence enlargement, green transition, and, this proliferation of misinformation. Really, they all come down to cohesion, to a cohesive approach by the Union, and therefore EU cohesion for such a disparate bloc and potentially an enlarging bloc is um, a constant issue that requires collaboration, innovation, and also for every member state to remain committed to the core values of, democracy, equity across the bloc, and now sustainability, which is a huge, huge challenge as we move into what could be quite turbulent times, both economically and geopolitically. Okay, I hope that's been useful, and I hope you managed to stick with the missing gaps exercise. And thank you very much for joining me.